welcome everybody. It's very nice to be able to chat to you. Okay, so it's Sensory Awareness Month. What does that mean? Why do we need to be aware of sensory?
I think it's interesting that you asked that question, Virginia, because I think we definitely, and I'm guessing a lot of people who are on this webinar with us, and go ahead and tell us if this is true for you guys as well, come across this thing where people have no idea what we're talking about when we say sensory processing, and no idea that it impacts them, not just other, right? Like people always think, well, I don't have sensory processing. It's like, well, if you're human, you kind of do.
Yeah. I don't believe in sensory processing.
Yeah, I don't believe in sensory processing, which is like, I don't believe in a nervous system, I guess.
Yeah, I don't. Do you believe in the respiratory system or the cardiovascular system? Yeah. So sensory integration and processing is sort of the long label that we've been asked to use by the American Occupational Therapy Association. They've asked everyone to use that. And really, it's a term that refers to a massive process that takes place in the brain and body that helps us make sense of what we sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Referring to those neurosensory mechanisms, or, we could get like the neurological underpinnings, how your brain and body, your nervous system registers, prioritizes, integrates, and processes sensation to give you the raw materials to construct your lived reality.
Right. I mean, it's our sensory systems that allow us to create meaning in our world. What mean to us? Is it important? Is it not important? Is it safe? Is it not safe? Is it enjoyable? Is it not enjoyable? And I'm sure we'll talk about this. I know we'll talk about this, but that information coming in through all of these different senses is a lot of what acts as a foundation for our emotional health and our mental health.
Yeah, and it's so different from person to person. And it always makes me think of this comedian in England. She was in Doctor Who for a while. She's very, very funny, and I'm forgetting her name. I'll remember it in a second. And one of the skits she used to do was a woman who was sensory over-responsive, basically, to sound, and really annoying to work with in an open office, in an open plan office. And every time the phone rang, she'd scream, and, and we kind of all know someone, a bit like that, or we are that person, if you're me. And that is what people mostly think about, isn't it? When they think about people's different sensory preferences, they think about the over-responsive person.
Yeah.
And it's more than that.
It's a lot more than that. I mean, I think sensory over-responsivity, like you said, whether it's sound, touch, smell, movement, and you are definitely not alone in that. That's my history as well. But it's kind of the squeaky wheel. It's the one that's easiest to see and easiest to explain, I think, for a lot of people. But there's so many other facets to sensory processing. And often, I think what people don't recognize is that disordered sensory processing is when you're having potentially an over-responsivity, but there are a lot of other different possible issues too that are going to impact your ability to interact with the world in a way that's comfortable for you, get joy and that meaning out of life too. So there's a distinct difference, right, between disordered sensory processing and this concept of sensory health that we're talking about.
Right. I mean, disordered sensory processing is, it's such an interesting piece of terminology, because, if we go back to thinking about the respiratory system, which isn't a perfect comparison, but we don't call asthma disordered respiration.
Interesting. I might start calling my asthma disordered respiration.
Disordered respiration. I do too. you know, and these different things. So yeah, disordered sensory processing is, you know, something that a lot of people identify with, where their experience of the world is, it requires more effort. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. It's disorganizing, confusing, right? There's a lot of different ways that disordered sensory processing sort of presents. And I think we're going to start getting more accurate in how we describe that as our measurement tools get better, right? You know, one thing you need is really good ways of measuring, and we can talk about that maybe if someone wants to. But so we've got sort of disordered sensory processing as this catch-all term for the way my brain and body are processing and integrating sensation from the world, right? I'm not able to make sense of what I sense. But, you know, what we talk about here a lot is how much of that is actually because of the way the world is designed. So this person, you know, disordered sensory processing might not be, I mean, we're a bit fatalistic about these things, I suppose, is what I'm saying. So, you know, disordered sensory processing, though, might not be really at the fault of the person. You know, if you're in Walmart, you're much more likely to have experiences like disordered sensory processing, or Disney. Where else can you think of?
Well, I think what you're alluding to, what you're getting at, is that it's this interaction between an individual's unique nervous system and the environment they live in that could cause the problems. It's not just all about that person.
Right. And if the environment is rigid, inhospitable, unwelcoming, and, you know, one size fits all, and it's, you know, as so many of our environments are, they're about the economy of moving people through the space, not the perceived safety and comfort of the people in the space, right? Airports are getting better, but, you know, there are so many places where it's really about like shepherding people. And so they're experienced as inhospitable, and they're built for one, right, like body type, like as if there is one. And so, you know, one of the things I always caution people when we talk about disordered sensory processing is, you know, I think a lot of people don't need to have that experience if we can adapt the environment and provide them with the right accommodations.
I think that's, well, I know it's shocking, but I agree with you, right? Like, I think
Basic principle of occupational therapy.
right. It's like, yeah. Right
but
there.
for some reason, we've sort of lost it a bit with this idea of SPD.
Yeah, and I don't want us to go too far off track, but I think, to your point, what that kind of reflects is, you know, this movement, which kind of brings us back to this idea of sensory health. We are moving away, a lot of the fields, a lot of different disciplines are moving away from a medical model, which points to the individual as having deficit, as lacking, as broken, as the problem. And I think that is kind of what you are speaking to, that we are moving thankfully, as a culture, as a time in our history, away from that, and recognizing that it's a lot more nuanced, a lot more dynamic, and it's not about a person being broken.
Yeah. And I think the other thing about, you know, that's one reason from moving from a pathology lens to a health lens, right, is because then it sort of takes the blame off the individual in a way, and we're looking at things from more of we're recognizing the complexity. But also the reason for sort of talking about health is because there's so much potential for our sensory systems to support wellness. And it's relevant for everyone. It's relevant for all 30 students in the classroom, you know, not just 16%. It's relevant to all sports people. It's relevant to everyone in the workplace, you know. And you think about this sort of spectrum of functioning, and you've also got people whose sensory integration and processing is such a huge part of their success, like Alia Reisman, you know, and one a phenomenal gymnast, Simone Biles, whose sense of their body in space and you know, ability to organize themselves in space is exquisite. But I've heard both of them describe other times when it's felt like it's got more cons than pros.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring up Simone Biles, and I think like also when we think about sensory health, people like Simone Biles who are so clearly gifted in some of their sensory motor and body-based processes
Yeah, amazing.
also have other neurodivergencies
Yeah.
that impact them. So there's this really interesting and complex and actually quite beautiful kind of balance that so many of us are trying to strike with the strengths and then recognizing the areas that we need to nurture, strengthen, or just be aware of, I guess. So, and when you're talking about sensory health and awareness, listen, we all do it. If everybody who's watching this can think about the fact that there's probably certain kinds of clothes that you prefer to wear when you're relaxing versus when you're on, or what color did you paint your bedroom? Because that's usually a good indicator. What kind of music do you listen to when you're in different moods? Like these are all the things that help feed our wellness. The foods we eat when we're feeling different ways, celebratory versus needing, that's why they're called comfort foods. So like all of those kinds of experiences impact us. I'm drinking my tea right now, and half of the reason I drink the tea is I like the feeling of the warmth.
And the sensory ritual. I love how Dr. Balliard, who's going to be at our symposium, talks about sensory anchors and being really deliberate about sensory anchors for health. And I would say, you know, having lived in different countries around the world, it's such a clever identification of something that can support your function or push you over the edge.
Right. And you, the same thing can do different things for you depending on where you're at, right?
Yeah. And
So,
all the way through life, right? We're not just talking about childhood. You know, I think it's of fundamental importance in those first 6-7 years of life, and in the even, you know, in early childhood as well, where we're sort of these sensory motor creatures. But the idea of sensory health and understanding the wisdom of your body and nurturing this aspect of our lifestyle is relevant all the way through life. It's particularly relevant, again, it sort of becomes really relevant in adolescence, and it becomes really relevant in older age too, but is something that we would benefit from being able to, like, you know, have really like weave it in to our sort of mainstream understanding of health. You know, would be, I mean, obviously this is our job, but we think it would be huge. We think it's really important.
I don't think there's going to be too much conflict in this conversation about this role. You know, and I'm sorry, I was looking at the chat because there was a question, and I'm thinking like this might be a nice way to end this segment before we launch into the next segment of this discussion. I'll read it for everyone. It's from Monica. And Monica shared, my main issue is to deal with those around my 8-year-old son who have labeled him from having ADHD to being in the spectrum just for having some sensory processing challenges. How can we respond to those people in order to set boundaries in their labels, which most of the times carry weight? They are special education teachers at school or close relatives. What are your thoughts on this, Virginia? This concept of labels and comes up a lot in our work.
Yeah, and I think that recognizing that someone is neurodivergent can be incredibly validating. And, you know, there's this sort of older notion that it's bad news when it really doesn't need to be perceived that way. So when a label is issued as a way of dismissing someone, then it's not so helpful, right? But when it is a way of helping a group and the village that's helping you raise your child, acknowledge that they experience the world differently, and that, you know, these aspects of their experience are at the moment uncomfortable, unpleasant, not helping. Let's change that. But these aspects of their experience are different, and we can affirm those. Then I think we're really moving towards a place where we recognize that diversity is really a natural part of being human, of being a living thing. And so, you know, we're all diverse. And then those of us that are neurodivergent, and we would include the people who identify with having disordered or very different sensory integration, as well as autistic, ADHD, and so on, that there's this point now where we're not scared of that anymore. We've got to come to this place where we're really able to just say, gosh, how useful to identify that this brain and body experience the world in different ways, and we can dive deeply into that and help this child experience joy and enjoy others and access the curriculum and experience mastery and sense of self in ways that suit their neurotype.
Right.
Is that, yeah, I mean, I could obviously talk about this for another hour, so I'm thinking you might want to ask another question.
No, I think that that was the main question that was asked. I think, like, when I hear you talk about it that way, it comes back to this idea also that you had introduced when we first started this talk, that sensory health is this awareness not only of our own individual differences and needs and strengths, but also recognition of how these match with whatever environment or context we're in.
Right.
And so what you're talking about, to me, having this recognition of, you know, we need to recognize when there is a mismatch and then be able to support it so that the individual, now I know this person was talking about the child, but I've found that this is very true for the adolescents, like you said, and the adults as well, being able to recognize where that mismatch is occurring so that we can better support on both ends. And then also, you know, when I think about these neurodivergent brains and all of the things I'm learning about as a parent and as an individual, is the strengths too that come to the table. And it's just as important to recognize and nurture those as support the needs or the mismatches.
Yes.
Both need to be nurtured.
And I think one of our, well, I know, Mim, that one of our biggest, like, big picture dreams and hopes when we talk about sensory health and helping people embrace the fact that everyone's very, very unique in the way they experience the world, is that it will support, like, more compassion and kindness in public spaces, in education spaces, and so on, like that. Like, when we start tuning in to the wisdom of our bodies and understanding that another person's body is wise in different ways, gosh, I really, really hope, I really do, that it will just help us stand down from some of the cultural narratives around different bodies and different experiences, and that different is inconvenient, uncomfortable, or, you know, those sorts of things. So yeah, that, you know, and that's why we think this is so important, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
So there was not exactly a question, but I thought this would be an interesting thing to kind of address and maybe add some clarity, some context to. Stacy, my gosh, it's so Monday. Stacy said, I typically use, quote, sensory safe, unquote. However, I like the concept of, quote, sensory health, unquote. Now, to me, I really love that Stacy is seeing both of these as positive. but to me, they are a little different.
Yeah,
Are
yeah,
they as well to you? Would you,
yeah.
like, what are your thoughts on, I think sensory safe falls into sensory health, potentially?
I mean, risk, like a little bit of stress is healthy, right? If it's the right amount. And a little bit of risk is healthy. Like we don't want just to live our lives without those pieces because they stretch us and they grow us. But everyone's little bit of risk and little bit of
Stress.
stress is different.
Mm.
That's one of the things this helps us understand. I really like sensory safe. We talk about these inclusive sensory friendly spaces, and they tend to really cater to your sensory over responsive body and not your body that has postural differences or motor differences or discrimination. I like the idea of sensory safe as sort of a very deliberate way of creating that felt safety that's so important, right? And another thing to consider when we're talking about all of these things again, and is the idea that your felt safety is different to my felt safety, and a lot of that's because we're sensory creatures with very different experiences of the world. And so yeah, there aren't one size fits all solutions, and we want to get to that point where we're able to offer tiered accommodations. Like one of the things I say a lot is we need to not normalize accommodations, not normalize people. We need to normalize diversity of learning styles and working styles and communication styles, not normalize people. And so sensory safety to me would sort of speak to that. Like, what about the classroom that has noise reduction headphones available as a matter of fact, standing desk options, different seating options, more than just one type of cushion, different fidget options, weighted options, the list goes on forever. But like, what about the learning community that normalizes that, and the teacher models it, right? Like, it's Monday morning, I'm needing this. It's Friday afternoon, I'm needing this. And, we use sensory informed strategies to support our health, to optimize our functioning and our learning and our participation. Mm-hmm. And that is very, very much something I would love to plug into the way universal design is conceptualized. Someone just asked, is that universal design? And that's actually a talk that I do sometimes. It's like, here's all the universal design pieces, and then here's how a sensory informed approach can elevate, dare I say, this concept.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Certainly create nuance. So I want to make sure that I keep track. What I'm looking at, everyone, is the chat to make sure that we're seeing what you guys are adding. And thank you. Keep adding your conversation components and questions. There's one here from Claudia, and then I will double back to you, Jen. But Claudia asks how to sensibilize people to recognize that this is an important aspect to encourage the senses, not just in disorders, but mm-hmm. to health in general.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love the way you're using the word sensibilize. It's like, get people aware of, right? And orient people to, so that they start to notice in their environment. And really, we just have to keep talking about it. We have to keep talking about it. We need to share resources. We need to, it's woven into other people's work, and it needs to be amplified, and that, how it's complex needs to be, articulated well. And that's one of the things that I think historically has been a challenge, is like, how do we describe what this means before the person we're talking to's eyes glaze over and we've lost them? And one of the things that we've been doing in this field of sensory integration historically is sticking to our jargon. And I get it, because moving away from jargon is so hard and effortful. But what happens is the people who know, and the people who don't are over here, and we're not meeting them in a relatable middle space. We're asking them to do all the work to come to us. And so we have to start figuring out health literacy principles. If you're a professional, look up health literacy. And we have to start figuring out like the layers of knowing. So I would say, you know, like what is the main point? Because one of the things we do, and you know, you and I have wrestled with this so many times, is we want to get across all the complexities and nuance all at the same time, and we don't want to miss anything out. And what's happened is that other people have simplified our message, and it's become oversimplified. So what we have to figure out is what's the main thing, and then what's the next level of complexity we add, and then what's the next level of complexity, so that people can journey into the whole story. But, you know, that we're not just, we don't have people saying things like, I don't believe in sensory, or, you know, only talking about SPD, and so on, so that, you know, we've got this understanding that this is an aspect of our humanity that we benefit from nurturing. And you know, one of the things for me that's so interesting about this point in time is that other people have started talking about this outside sort of the sensory integration discipline. And they've started talking about it in slightly different ways. So we've got people talking about like somatic experiences and bringing them into mental health. And what, you know, a big part of what they mean is all of the feelings you have in your body, even the ones that map to emotions, paying attention to those and not just like talking to someone, right? Not just brain to brain. You've got other people talking about embodied psychology, embodied cognition, embodied sense of self. And again, like that, what is that? That is the experience of being in your body and tuning into the wisdom of your body and what it tells you about yourself and the world around you. So we're at this point in time when other people are noticing the importance of sensory integration and processing and are giving it slightly different labels. And it really shows me how awareness of this domain is essentially a bridge between physical health and mental health, right? My sensory integration and processing, my registration of sensation, all of those different things is mapped to my feelings and my emotions, is mapped to my ability to relate to you and other people. It's 100% social, and it's 100% emotional, and it's also 100% not. It's sensation as well. It's like there's this complexity, but this domain of sensory health really, I think, can act as a bridge between these sort of weird silos we've created of physical health and mental health. And so, you know, we go to the gym to look after our bodies, and we go to the counselor to look after our feelings, and we, you know, go to the speech therapist to work on communication or whatever. And we want to bring it all together, right? And we want everyone to understand how these pieces map, they dually code, they overlap, all of these different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that actually kind of links into a question that we were just asked from Renee. I know my answer to this question. Do you think having teachers learn about sensory health should be part of their college education so they can better meet the needs of their students? Many teachers teach with a quote, one size fits all, end quote, approach.
So like, yes, and it's going to take time. So how are you going to make the time? Like we have a whole program for teachers that's post-registration. But we'd love, I mean, really what we'd love to see, I think, is all the way through people's education, that this conversation extends beyond the five senses and starts to really, go into some of this depth and complexity with those layers, so that when, you are at your teacher training, it's not the first time you've heard that there's more than five senses, for example, those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, having now worked a lot with educators and creating content for them and to
Mm-hmm.
help explain these things, that, I think things are changing, like you said, which is good. Now there is quite the focus on social emotional learning in
Mm-hmm.
school, and the kids know that it's called social emotional learning, and yet we still, to your point, have not given them some of these bridges. There's thinking learning, there's social emotional learning, but getting in contact with your body and what it's like for you to live in it is still not necessarily seen as part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
So I find that very, very interesting.
When
So
did you first sort of cotton on to this idea of sensory integration as so pivotal to human development?
probably implicitly as a kid, because I
Uh-huh.
was not very comfortable in my own body.
Oh.
So that didn't seem to be happening for everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
But explicitly, probably not that far after, in my early 20s when I was being trained. Like, there was a recognition that in a lot of what I did, something was missing. And so
Mm-hmm.
I pursued sensory integration training at that time. And to me, it just kind of filled a lot of, it bridged a lot of these things. It just really makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
The way we're talking about the sensory health and well-being, as well as processing differences in how it impacts your health and well-being. It's all it's all connected.
Mm-hmm.
And I know sometimes that can sound very hoodoo hippie, maybe. I mean, being from Los Angeles, I know that that's usually what people first think of when I say these things, but I do mean it truly on this really, like, no, like literally, physiologically and neurologically, it's all connected.
Right.
Like, it's not just a feel good kind of concept. So how
So
about
wait,
you?
I want to ask you another question. So talk to me about, because one of the things you're really good at explaining is like how this understanding more about sensory integration, and then we've talked a little bit about sensory over-responsive, is different to understanding regulation, and self-regulation and co-regulation. What if you could explain that to sort of a group of eighth graders right now, what would you say?
The difference between sensory processing and regulation?
Self-regulation,
Self-regulation.
co-regulation.
I think if I was talking to a bunch of eighth graders, my explanation would be that they are related to each other. One's going to impact the other. That regulation and our ability to be in sync with the context, the situation we're in, which is how I like to define regulation. When we are regulated, we're in sync with what's happening around us. Is that sensory processing can be one of the ways we help ourselves become regulated. It's also one of the ways we can easily find ourselves dysregulated, but there's a lot of ways to find regulation, a lot of ways to find self-regulation, and co-regulation is one of those complex ways where there's a relational component that also has a sensory component, right? We think about parents and children, and it's proximity, and it's so you use a great term, sociosensory cueing, the touch, the look, the tone of voice, the posture of our bodies, the movement, and it's also energetic. Like, you can tell when someone again, my Los Angeles is coming out, but when someone's connected to you, that's connectedness. And when they're not, they can go through the motions and not be
Mhm.
connected. So I think that finding self-regulation, finding a way to find that feeling of being in sync with what's around you can come from sensory processing strategies or needs. It can also come from a lot of other ways too.
And so you talk about being in sync with the environment. So like regulation then isn't about like, it's not self-control. It's not like, you know, me being able to manage myself. It's more of like in my body, I'm able to be here. I haven't had too much coffee. I haven't had too little coffee if it's me. It's self, so this idea of regulation is I guess, I mean, the way we talk about it with our jargon is we talk about state arousal, we talk about wakefulness. What's a non-jargon way of describing it?
So to me, and I'm trying to think about a whole bunch of things. Yeah. So because some people might get a little confused. You and I know, again, shocking, come from the same camp that we believe self-regulation is foundational to self-control. And I know that there is a different, that where that's actually flipped. But for us, self-regulation is that my body and that my cognitive state and my emotional state and my ability to engage with my environment, my context, my situation, others around me, is all in sync. And so, oh my gosh, it is clearly I'm not having a regulated moment. Tell me your question one more time.
How do you explain regulation to
Okay.
your Uber driver? There's 3 minutes left of the journey, and they've just asked you what it is.
I think, how do I explain? It is when your body, and if I were explaining this to my Uber driver, when your body, your heart rate, your breathing, your brain's thinking, and your emotional experience are all working together with the environment you're in. So if you're driving me right now, you are hopefully feeling calm enough to pay attention to the road. Cognitively, you can follow the directions of the GPS system, and your body is relaxed, and you're not feeling a strong need to eat or run to the restroom or escape. So to me, it's that everything is, when we're regulated, we are fully present. And it feels comfortable to be present to me.
I like that. And I think about the times when we need to disengage to stay somewhat regulated. So regulation changes. And so how regulated I am when I'm playing a team sport is different to when I'm in the library, is different to when I'm able to say, actually, the best thing for me right now is no humans. But I love that language you used. I'm totally checking the timestamp so we can go back and get that little soundbite, that little quote of yours.
How to talk to your Uber driver about regulation. Everybody take notes. Yeah. Yeah. And having a background in mental health that I got after many years of working in sensory, it was fascinating to me to be in that program, to have these amazing colleagues in a cohort who knew nothing about this and who couldn't understand why their top-down, more talk-based approaches could only get so far with some people. And then they experience burnout as a result. And so much of it to me was this lack of understanding, or even this lack of exposure to the idea. Frankly, it wasn't even that they didn't understand it. Nobody had ever discussed it, of this like connection between our sensory experiences, our bodies regulation, our brains regulation, having to work together. So yeah, and I just think that that's kind of fascinating on the psychological mental health side, how much, as well as education, these things require good sensory health
Mm-hmm.
in order to have the benefits that we all hope for.
What are the implications of that for consequence-based, incentive-based strategies? No, you don't want to go there?
I don't love that. Ooh, hit me with, thank you. You're usually the one who handles that one. So yeah, it doesn't make sense. How about that? It just doesn't make sense. If we are not helping someone tune into what they need in any given moment, like you said, some my regulation should be different when I'm playing my soccer game versus library versus I'm checking in and I think I just need some quiet time by myself. When we connect actions only to an external reward that we don't even know if that really meets a need somehow. It's
Is
just
it meaningful?
us.
Yeah.
Is exactly. Is it really meaningful to us? What are we really learning? I think that we really limit people. We really limit the lived experience. We really limit their ability to find their full humanity. And as you always talk about, to self-actualize, to know who they are and what that means to them in this world right now. And so not a fan. How about you?
I mean, you know, I feel very similarly. And I think for me, the part that's missing is like that we've moved away from helping humans self-actualize, and like a lot of classroom design nowadays has been diluted by the need to manage a large group of children on limited resources. And so a lot of classroom design and educational design has been diluted by the need for convenience. And so convenience is starting to be prioritized over creating a little group of self-organized human beings. And I know teachers feel that conflict. Many teachers feel that conflict very deeply.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just, Carmen actually essentially just said the same thing in chat, that yes, but it's part of everyday school for children. Consequences and rewards are the same for all. And I think that has less to do with the individual child's experience and more to do with the teacher's experience of feeling like they can get their job done.
I think that's a huge part of it. I mean, it's also baked into our culture, and I'd point people towards Alfie Kohn's books to read more about, you know, this sort of consequence-based or consequence-obsessed culture that we operate in now. But you know, we haven't sort of been asked to talk about how people can advocate for and talk about their own sensory needs, and I feel like that fits in very nicely here. How, you know, if we're talking about the fact that it's not yet the first stop of the caregivers and the administrators and the managers, how can we help our clients and ourselves live in this world right now? How can they self-advocate?
And I think, you know, and I think you're probably getting to this too, right? And I think for those of us who are either parenting young children, teaching young children, or clinically working with young children, like that's hard. Like, so how am I supposed to get the 3-year-old to advocate for themselves? And I think you and I agree that this, you know, if we go through the life trajectory, that so much of that first comes from the primary caregivers being attuned, kind of learning about that individual's responses and what seems to work and not work, and being the first voice to advocate for them.
Such an important point.
Yeah. And then,
So
How do you see that?
So the first thing then isn't actually sort of changing the child, but it's helping the caregivers begin to attune to the child's unique experiences and processing capabilities, and then do that advocacy so that it becomes sort of second nature to the child.
Right.
Wouldn't that be great?
And then, you know, we know, like, so in these healthy, nurturing relationships, right, when that attunement happens, when the person, when the caregiver recognizes and then also responds in a way that's supportive and nurturing and warm, like, so the messaging is, this is part of you and this is safe and this is good and this is okay, then that part of that understanding, the child starts to integrate and understand, this is what I need for me. Right? I need to eat when I'm hungry, and I need to go to the bathroom when I feel this urge, and I need quiet time after there was a big event, and whatever it is.
So again, like, we're normalizing the accommodations, we're normalizing the supports and the scaffolding and this way of embracing diversity and divergence instead of normalizing the people.
Right.
We're addressing a different system, not the systems of the person, but the systems the person,
the experience,
inhabits.
Yeah. And then I think, you know, as that happens, then the child starts to learn the words. I need this right now. I need that right now. And maybe they haven't put the whole picture together over time, but they will start to
Really
context and need and be able to say, in these situations, this is what's going to work for me.
Yeah, my brain just exploded because as you were saying that, I was thinking about, like, so one of the things that I think therapy's gone a bit off the tracks with is teaching children to request items. And so, you know, it becomes about asking for the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm suddenly thinking about how many times a child has been taught to ask for the thing, but really they're uncomfortable in their body. And if we could have taught them that first.
Right.
Gosh, my brain just exploded. Anyway, that's
okay. So then,
whole different
well, it's already in many, many pieces. Let's keep that explosion going, because actually, when your brain explodes, it's usually a good thing, versus when it happens to me. But so if that's the young child's experience, and in terms of avocation, let's move this developmental trajectory forward. What do you think that then looks like and means for the adolescent, for the adult?
Self-advocacy.
Yeah, like, so we've been talking about, so what, let's say that's great, that the attunement, the awareness, that happened young, but that doesn't, as
what if it didn't?
Doesn't. So what does it mean when the 13, 14, 15-year-old is starting to come into awareness, or is starting to have so much conflict in context that everything is breaking down?
The environment's harder, the demands are harder, there's less individualization, which is such a weird phenomenon in our schooling system, that when you make it to college and university, suddenly there's a lot more allowance for, like, individualized, like, adult learning can be individualized, but pedagogical approaches require everyone to sit on a specific spot on the carpet. I mean, it's such a bizarre contradiction. But, you know, one of the things when we're talking about the fact that our children have to operate in this world right now, right? Not the perfect world that we'd like them to be in. One of the things I really like thinking about is, you know, the child who finds eye contact difficult, greeting their teacher for the first time, with or without eye contact. You know, a lot of people think it's better on that first one to give the eye contact, but greeting them in some way where they can make a connection and then immediately say, I find listening easier when I don't have to look at someone's face. And so I won't make eye contact the way you expect me to, but I want you to know that that's because I'm really listening and I'm really interested in what you have to say, or something like that, whatever works for the context. But, you know, just immediately sort of say, like, naming it and make and no big dealing it,
Mhm.
and educating others.
Yeah, and for the adolescent, I think that for those who can engage in those conversations, for those who qualify for 504s, IEPs, even at home, as you navigate, negotiate those contracts, quote, contracts at home with your caregivers, your parents, your family, having, first of all, having the adolescent at the table and asking the question, how could this work better for you? Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
that's simple, just asking the question, like, how could this work better for you?
Mm-hmm.
What would feel supportive? What would feel easier? What would feel better? Because I know in adolescence, being able to advocate for yourself is probably one of the harder things that they're learning to do, and I think still need scaffolding to do it. And so for the adolescents, being able to have that conversation, kind of like the extension of what we talked about for the young child, I've noticed that when
Mm-hmm.
this is set up this way, it seems to work better for you. What's been,
Mm-hmm.
is that how it felt on the inside? And starting to help them bring attention to that and be part of the conversation. And to me, for adults, so many of the adults that we see, I think at our program, it starts first, the acknowledgement of this is real. This
Mm-hmm.
this is a thing. And yeah, like,
Sorry,
where,
no one's talked to you about it thus far.
sorry about that, that the world has let you down. And then the safe exploration of, like, so what does feel good? Just starting with what does feel good,
Mm-hmm.
that expansion, so that the adult can learn that that embodied feeling, like, I can feel good, I can feel safe. So it's worth advocating for because I'm worth feeling good and feeling safe.
Mm-hmm.
And then learning to do that. Um, so there was a question, as an adult, how do you self-advocate in the workplace and more importantly in relationships? Well, that's
Mm-hmm.
an easy question.
I mean, yeah, but I feel like I've done a bit of it um in my relationships, and like realizing, like with my husband, we've been married for 20 years. We have learned over time that to pay attention to this domain. Right now, he obviously didn't have a choice because this is my job and this is who I am. But like realizing that light touch for me is very disorganizing and can push me over the edge real quick. So just talking about that and what that means and the implications and different strategies. Certain noises, I'm actually quite over responsive to sound, and I have very noisy children. And so just figuring that out, and like there's no guilt in it, and like just being able to take space when I need to or whatever, like just again, it's like normalizing the flexibility of a sensory informed lifestyle has been huge.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
we have um, some similar things. I think, how do you do it with good intention, with not as an angry approach, as a, I think you care and you want me to feel good, comfortable, happy, fill in your blank. So I'm going to share this with you about me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's how it's about functional communication. Here's what I need in this moment, in this situation. And I think, there's no right way to do it, but also by modeling, like showing people, when you have those opportunities. So I've got my headphones with me, or I've got, what is it that I've got?
Mm-hmm.
I'm showing you that this is what works for me as well. I know You were talking about some of your needs. I know my office at Star is kind of well known for being my sensory safe place. I have created my zone, my lighting, my textures around me, my colors on the wall, my diffuser, the things that may help me in whatever it is, either stay more grounded, more alert, more comfortable, whatever. So I don't think there's a right way. But I think, and I'm still learning to do this, quite frankly, if I'm being honest, but knowing that I deserve to feel okay. So, and I think it's just starting there, and then being able to hopefully have someone who's willing to explore how best to do this with me. Or if I know, being able and willing to communicate that before the dysregulating situation sets in. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just remembering a conversation I had with a young man I was working with and his mum, where he finally realized that the word to describe light touch in his experience was pain. And
yeah,
the sudden understanding, I think, and the realization, first of all, for him, that not everyone felt that way, and therefore there was an explanation for why he was uncomfortable in public spaces and considered awkward and difficult in public spaces. That wasn't him being a bad kid, right? And then for his mum to just like sit with the significance of light touch being painful for her child, and how that reframed so many of their interactions and the things that she's been talking to him about over and over and over and over again. And it was such an important moment for them both, and very much a privilege to be there with them when they had this realization.
Yeah.
And you've had that moment as the therapist where you're like, gosh, I wish someone could have figured this out for you when you were 3 instead of when you were 11. And those sorts of things.
Yeah, I've definitely had many of those moments, and it actually kind of echoes what Stacy shared in chat, that many parents struggle with understanding how their child's sensory system is different from their own, with the fact that their child experiences things differently than themselves, because so many of us look at our children and think that they are just mini me's, little copies, Xerox copies, and that. But
there's very few of these parenting books that even mention how sensory integration might be different from child to child. Which is why I like Megan, and I'm probably going to say her last name wrong. Let me just check. Fowler. Baby Sense and Baby Feeding Sense. They're older books now, but they really just introduce these concepts nicely at a very accessible level. There was a question about books like this for adolescents, and I think Lindsay Beale's done a workbook for adolescents.
She has, and actually, I think someone was kind enough to list Lindsay in a whole list of these great.
But I did think, there's a novel that a lot of my adolescents are really relating well to, and it's about an autistic girl in Scotland. And she's got older twin sisters. One of them is also on the spectrum and the other isn't. And she's just really talking about her experience as someone who processes the world differently, and some of it's sensory. So, I haven't met a family yet that didn't love it. It's such a lovely, lovely book. It's called A Kind of Spark by Elle McNichol. And it's about adolescents.
I have very large Amazon bill. Hold on.
Yeah. So use Amazon Smile, everyone. If you are going to buy these books, it would be so great if you could use Amazon Smile and nominate Star as your charity. That would be, I sometimes think I fund Star through Amazon Smile, but every little bit helps. So Yeah, A Kind of Spark by Elle McNichol is just lovely, lovely novel.
Done. Yeah, I'm looking at the time, and there's so many places I'd like to take this, but something that I'm noticing that's coming up in chat quite a bit, and I do feel it's relevant, and I actually think you are a perfect person to talk about this with, Virginia, is the role, not the role of, the intersectionality of trauma.
Oh yeah.
And sensory health, or actually, I guess it wouldn't be sensory health, but
Yeah.
what this impact of trauma, and how we, much like we've been talking about, kind of broadening this concept of sensory health, I think it's useful to kind of talk about the trauma, how we are conceptualizing it now. And I know you've done extensive work on this, and we'll be sharing a model of this at our symposium in a couple of weeks. But do you mind?
In a couple of weeks, in a week? Yeah, in a week and a half.
I'm rounding up.
Yeah, I'm going to be sharing how a lot of it's about how like the sensory lens broadens our trauma lens. And you know, our neurodivergent community members experience chronic trauma and micro trauma in so many more ways than we traditionally acknowledge with our mainstream models of trauma, even with adverse childhood experiences. And so, there's also these huge social pieces as well. So I'll be presenting a sort of a theoretical frame for looking at that and really comprehensively. But I would say that to be trauma informed is more than, it's a way of being. It's so much more than a weekend course. It's a way of professionally existing in a space that where you support humans. And I really would advocate that a huge part of that should be, you know, working really hard to be sensory informed and understand these hugely complex processes that everyone experiences all the time, right? And the impact they have on health and wellness and sense of self. And you just sent that to everyone.
I really did, didn't I? Wow, that's fantastic.
See if you can delete it. And then I think you should pop off for a second and come back in a minute.
I should. Thank you. I'll be right back.
So yeah, so I don't want to talk about it too much now, but that trauma and sensation piece is huge. And I think I really want, I don't want to oversimplify it. I don't want to pay it enough. I don't want to pay it too little attention, but I also want to recognize that we can't, you know, go into it in as much detail as we should now. But I do think that they need to go together. The AOTA recent book, Trauma, Occupation and Participation, Mim, myself, and Amy Lynch. Hang on, give me 2 seconds. I'm going to try and show you. And then the first author was Kim Clary. We did do a chapter in here, and it's called Trauma in Neurodivergent Populations. And I think that's a really good start. It's a great book, actually. It's such a timely, well, overdue, very much needed book. So I would recommend having a look at that. So, okay, other questions that we have, let's have a look. Trainings or certifications for social workers who want to work with late diagnosed women, as there are no resources in your city. So late diagnosed women, okay, so I would go to, now you're gonna have to just bear with me so that I get people's names right. So Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, awnnetwork.org, because you said late diagnosed. I'm just seeing Jen's comments. Okay, yeah, got it. All right. And then I would also point people towards a website that contains very high quality, excellent information called Neuroclastic. So neither of those are offering certificates. There is a group called Foundation for Neurodivergent Minds who do offer a certificate. I haven't done it, but from what I've seen, I really like what I see. If anyone's done it and they want to comment on it, that would be really great, but that is not like any specific to any discipline. So as a social worker, I think that could be really good. We also offer a foundations course where you really get into sort of what sensory integration is and how it underpins human development and the domains of relationship and regulation. What a big question, Beth. I love it. Have I missed any sort of answers to that, trainings or certification? I do think the STAR trainings are good, but I don't, I obviously have a bias.
I think from the social work perspective, I have looked into, as a social worker, I've looked into some of them, and they're very specific. There isn't one that actually looks at the whole thing. You can find treatment, you can get certified treatment approaches that look that I'm forgetting everyone's name. Clearly, I'm still a little dysregulated, but that where you pay attention to body reactions, body responses.
Kelly Mahler.
Yeah, no, not Kelly Mahler. This is actually in the mental health field.
Oh, okay. Pat Ogden.
Pat Ogden, I think. There's also another touch-based therapy. But again, I think what you're asking for is something a little more comprehensive. These are good. I've always thought these were good starts in the mental health field, and I'm glad that they exist. I think that there's more, there's a richness there and a complexity that still needs to be better understood and applied in the mental health field. But these are very good places to start. And I will see if I can look those up as well.
And then Beth asked this big question: what are your suggestions for sensory health advocacy at the bureaucratic IEP level of the education process? So do you mean writing an IEP, or are we going even higher up the bureaucracy than that, Beth?
Yeah, Beth, share with us. Very
higher. Love it.
Oh, so more policy level.
Well, I mean, there's so many sort of systems that we can work on. I love the idea of whole, like the tiered approach to supporting schools. So whole school education should involve the administration, and then could it also include district level educators and so on? And when you get whole districts involved in understanding this, I think they see real differences. And we've seen that with districts that have implemented trauma-informed practices to a certain degree. And we're starting to see it with some districts that STARS worked with, where we're more and more implementing sensory-informed practice at school. I think a sensory-informed approach, a trauma-informed approach, and paying attention to moving away from the medical model is really what's needed. And we need to, I think we need to educate at those levels and be sharing this information.
Yeah, and we do, when we train on this, we do have specific trainings for this, for educators and for occupational therapists working in a school-based setting. We actually do talk about appreciative inquiry. What are the next steps for you and your system to make these things work and work better, including at the higher levels, policy, advocacy, administrative levels. So it is doable. I've seen it done. I've seen districts who get it and like you said, Virginia, benefit all the more from it. There's clearly work in those areas, but you don't have to leave it out of an IEP process. There are ways to address sensory needs, relational needs, in your 504s and IEPs. I know I've shared with Virginia the funny story of one of my children. I thought it was funny. I'm not sure anybody else in the room did, but my oldest had a 504, and he was in high school, and he was part of the process. And really, so many of the strategies that worked for him at that stage were relational. And so I kind of tore apart the 504 and applied tools that STAR uses to the 504, and kind of took over the meeting and said, so here are the things that, and what works for you here and what works for you here, and getting them as part of the 504, and they were accepted in the 504. So there are ways to do it, and don't give up on that. It needs to be recognized as part of this whole student and their whole experience in the school setting.
Yeah, it's a huge conversation. We did do a goal setting webinar recently. I'm not sure where that's available. I can try and find it. It was one of our free webinars, or it wasn't. It might have been one of our $10 webinars, but we can try and find the information about that. And we are going to run that again on a rotation, because it's such a big, it's a lot of unlearning, which is something we haven't talked about yet, actually. So much of this work is about unlearning things that are sort of baked into the way we do life. This idea that there's a right way to be human, and in fact, there is no right way to be human. So we're unlearning a lot. And that sort of makes me think about this question from Isabel earlier. It's fascinating to think about how different arenas are incorporating sensory processing matters like mental health, cognition, OT. For policy and practices to change, is having an identity-based approach helpful for raising awareness? I'm thinking about the identification of highly sensitive person, which shows up in the mental health space. Is that a helpful identity for sensory processing more generally? Or is neurodivergent a better catch-all? What are better identity labels for advocacy and pride? And so, I mean, my immediate reaction to that is I actually think talking about what we call in OT the client factors is a massively important step forward. And so I don't know, I'm not against, identification as a highly sensitive person. I am against using other labels to avoid an autism label because we think that's bad news. I think we have to move away from that. And I think that's our job as practitioners. If we at our core flinch at the tragedy of the autism story, the people we work with will feel that, and it will speak to their sense of self. And I think that's a huge part of the work we have to do. But with this sort of wide variety of labels, is an identity first approach good for advocacy? I don't know, but I do think identifying contributors to function and participation, or lack thereof, is hugely important. And I think we have to get people away from being defensive and closed off to the possibility that differences in sensory integration and processing are a factor, are a contributor. So, talking about sensory discrimination and getting into it, that this child can feel they're being touched, but they don't know how hard or who by, whether it's threatening or whether it's friendly, and their body therefore responds in a primitive self-protective way. Identifying that as soon as possible, that is a client factor that is contributing to their difficulties with meaningful participation at school. Does that make sense? I've used a lot of OT jargon just then, but really for me, just a big part of it is saying, here's the diagnosis and that helps me in these ways, but right now what we're talking about is this contributing factor.
Right. I agree. And I think I know we speak a lot about the autistic community when we have these conversations. It's a robust, vibrant, well-informed community. And and other neurodivergent related communities might not have the same robustness yet. So it's an interesting concept, this identity. I'm thinking of, ADHD, which is really dispersed, and the community isn't quite, hasn't, what am I trying to say, formed in the same way as a lot of the autistic communities.
Well, I mean, the autistic community is also quite divided, and there's a lot of people.
And that actually, so that was kind of where I was going, is that identity first. And I was actually thinking of parallel groups that have nothing to do with this conversation. Even within those groups, that identity means a lot of different things, and can be, to your point, can actually be diversive as well as community building. And so
divisive,
so I think, to your point, and divisive, thank you. So to your point, like, it always just comes back down to that individual's, what works best for them, and in terms of like how it helps them move through. Like, my children use their labels, and they take a lot of pride in their labels, and what those labels mean to them, and what it means that they need, and how, like that, back to your client factor discussion. So it comes back, it's not a one size fits all conversation or strategy, I guess.
No, you've got to ask the person. It's very, very, and even within a family, I've met where the mum uses identity first language, and the child uses person first language, and so on. So yeah, I would say, for me, the biggest point is to keep the main thing. And a lot of that is about building understanding and educating others in what the sensory domain even is, how it underpins so much of human development and functioning. And I think, and that's a lot of what we're going to be doing this month. This is like a supercharged sensory awareness month. There's going to be infographics released all the way through the month, with illustrations by the wonderful artist Jacinta Reed. We're going to be really trying to destigmatize certain topics and simplify, understand, use relatable language, offer resources that we think will be helpful. And so there's going to be these different topics, and hopefully sort of starting something new. And remember, we have our sensory stories as well from previous sensory awareness months. So I just want to really share those with you. They're in different languages. They're in many of them have been translated to different languages. And so we've got, now let me just find the link. We've got stories in German, Arabic, Chinese, Spanish, Italian. There they are. And this is a way where we're really trying to get that relatable information out there. So you've got our first ever sensory story was Laura, and she is just the most delightful 6-year-old having a really hard time at school because of dyspraxia, and really being poorly understood. And then we've got more and more of these stories that we're really proud of, and again illustrated by the wonderful Jacinta Reed, who is just a phenomenal artist. And so each of those stories is a way of helping people relate to the aspects of differences in sensory integration and processing, and how they impact function and well-being. So there's that. And then of course there's our Sensory Awareness Month this year, where you're going to be getting these infographics and as many free resources as we can get into your hands. Yeah, so, oh, and then this link here that Mim dropped is the current infographic. What is sensory health? See if you can spot a little character on each of the infographics. There should be someone familiar popping up and with little comments every now and then. I'm not sure Mim even knows about this, but you can have a look and see if you can spot the little character who is filling people in on what's going on. So yeah, so sensory awareness, we really want to get to that point where our understanding of sensory health is baked in. It's baked into our understanding of human development, right? And so we would understand it from the moment our baby's life outside the womb starts all the way through. Mim, I wonder if there's anything you'd really want to add and emphasize.
Well, first, I would just like to thank everybody who came to this, who wanted to learn more or to feel validated in what they already know, because so many of you know so much. Also, those of you who shared your stories, your questions, thank you for that vulnerability. And I know we didn't get to all of them, and for that, we are sorry if we didn't quite get to you. I think this is an area that requires continued learning and understanding on everyone's parts. Those of us who have the knowledge to share it, to help it become baked in, and those of us who are already doing the work to continue to try to better understand the information as it comes out and how we can use that to support others, and to change policy, change systems, change what's going on in the world, and to know that you're not alone on whatever side of this you are. You're just not. There's lots of us doing this too. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, and I hope, have a look at our website. The blog has resources. It's not super up to date, but the resources are up to date. So there's a really nice blog post called Sexuality Through the Senses. We have a sensory self-care bingo. There's a Stephen Porges video that was really fun to make with Dr. Porges. And there's so many pieces there. I think there's even a blog post on, I will just double check before I lie to you all, understanding all the different reasons someone might crave sensation. And I clicked on it and it didn't open. So I will try and find that. And we can post that on our page. I think one of the things you all sort of asked, a theme that we're seeing is that, as we talk about sensory health over the lifespan, it's also really important to recognize that our needs are going to change over the lifespan. And so, we might find our groove at 6, 7, 8 years old, and then at that middle school sort of transition age, need some support again, or at adolescence need some support again, or in a big life transition, becoming a mother, moving cities, external events like global pandemics, all sorts of things that might change our needs. And so, a sensory informed approach is dynamic because people are dynamic. It's not about finding one right answer and then being done. And that's why we're sort of students of this all our lives. Mm-hmm. So I hope that helps. There's obviously so much more to talk about. For those of you who are really looking at that autism piece, we've had a few questions about that. We do recommend the Inside Autism course by Kieran Rose, and we are hoping to host that on the American time zone soon. And we also recommend NeuroBears, which they're sponsors of our symposium, and they provide lovely resources for explaining what neurodivergence is in a non-pathologized way. So it's pandasonline.org, and they are sponsors of our symposium this year. We hope to see you at symposium. It's going to be great. It is in person. If you want to come and see us, that would be really fun. And if not, it is virtual. It will be broadcast, and you will get access to all the recordings.
And because so many questions were brought up around education, IEPs, etc., also in November next month already, we will have our virtual summit, sensory health in a school setting. And we're going to be covering a lot of what was actually brought up during this.
Right, actually, yeah.
So, and that's all virtual. So definitely check that out. And we really hope you guys continue to come back and continue the conversations with us.
Thank you.